This is Cassian and Sawyer coming through Maggie's mic, but the stream is still through my Discord. Hopefully this will actually work.
Fingers crossed, right?
Thank you all for showing up. Please fill in the sign-up sheet if you can. That really helps us out by showing people how many people come to our club and who loves our events. And we will get started here. So, welcome to the SCAD Creature Design Crash Course. This is going to be very surface level, because an hour is not nearly enough time to talk about creature design, and we've already used up most of that hour trying to get this to work in the first place. So sorry, you might miss some stuff at the end, but hopefully this will all go smoothly from here out. We're going to be focusing, or at least I'm going to be focusing mainly on biological creatures. Oh, that's an echo. Things that can at least somewhat plausibly exist in reality, and bring that groundedness into your designs. So let's see what we're going to get started here. I'm going to go through three main sections with this presentation, starting off by being able to identify your purpose for the creature and knowing what kind of pipeline you're going to be concepting for, because each pipeline needs very different things. And we'll also talk a little bit about creature design for a specific audience. Concepting, you always want to have your audience in mind. SCAD drills that into you, right? So we'll briefly touch that in a very creature-oriented idea. Then we're going to get into the wildlife biologist role with talking about anatomy, reference, and making these things at least somewhat believable to ground your designs. And then finally end off with making it iconic, showing you how to push shape language to create a really memorable creature in any style, not just super stylized ones where you've got the big bulky shapes. All right, so let's get started here. What is your creature for? When you're concepting for anything, you want to first nail what the purpose of it is. If you're doing this in the industry, you have that pretty much laid out for you by your employer. But if you're doing something for a portfolio, you're going to want to choose what broader scope this creature will fit into. Is it going to be a 2D animation, a 3D animation, a live-action movie, or a video game? Thinking through those steps will help you know what to put forward, so that employers can see you know what they're looking for. So to go through a couple of the kinds of industries you'll be looking at, starting with 2D animation, you're going to want to use much more simple shapes, because these things will have to be drawn over and over and over again. You'll have to do a full turnaround for how they look, but because it's 2D, you can push those designs a little bit. You can exaggerate. You don't have to know that every single muscle ligament is going to work that way in all three dimensions. As you can see with Beast here, you also can do a lot more with squash and stretch and exaggeration, so that you can push that personality, how something moves, how it gives off the storytelling, rather than in 3D, where you have to know how it's going to work in a physical space. It's much more important with 3D stuff that you know the full form that you're modeling. For 3D concepts, you're going to want to have a full turnaround, like we said before. But you'll also want to have things like callouts. As you can see with the sheet on the right, you've got not only the full body, but also the tear off with the arms. You can see what's underneath. You've got the callouts on how the eye looks, how the inside of the mouth looks. All that's very important for handing it off to a modeler and having it make sense so your modelers still like you and want to work with you in the future. Important for games too, you want to show them some sketches of how the creature will interact with the player, what its purpose is. In some cases, like with the little palamute on the left, how it attacks. Does it use a sword? That's something that you're not going to see if you just have a sketch of a dog, right? So getting into the nitty-gritty stuff like that for a 3D animation is very important. You can get a lot more detailed with things for 3D, though, because once it's modeled and rigged, you don't have to go over and over again to redraw that. It's just going to get animated by 3D animation. Fair warning, the next slide is a little bit gory. I will tell you when it's gone. It should just be brief, but it's important to cover. Because for things like TV and film, you're going to know exactly what is on screen at any point. You'll have the plot in front of you. So you can dictate your time very appropriately. If the creature's never going to have like a close-up shot on its foot, you don't have to figure out how each toe ligament works, right? You can just focus on what actually needs the time on screen. And that helps you with budgeting too. TV is very much focused on getting things out quickly and for a low budget. You might also have to concept what it looks like as that creature changes over the course of the plot, right? For example, with the Witcher Basilisk here, During its fight scene, its face gets burned. And it was the job of the concept artist to figure out what that looks like. Does it get super bloody? Does it get charred? Does it get very, bright red? And then, of course, going even more extreme, what does it look like when its face gets entirely ripped in half? Does it have all the sinew? Is it clean break? Is it very, weird and gushy, right? With TV and film, you need to think in, key points and key art, that kind of brain mindset, in order to get your stuff going out and being the most useful for your art director. So, knowing your intended audience. Intended audience is very important for anything you're doing. It's who you want to sell this to, right? We have two very different intended audiences here. My Neighbor Totoro is obviously aimed for a much younger audience. Everything is bright, everything has these big open shapes to stimulate the brain but leave places to rest for someone who's younger. You've also got very few actual pointed shapes, even with the roundness of the teeth of the cat bus. Those would be pointed, but they're rounded to make it seem more friendly, because everything here is friendly. It's supposed to be this magical, mystical area. You've also got a lot more room to suspend belief, because that is a bus made out of cat. You don't need to have so much worry about how things specifically work if you're aiming for people who have a little bit more mysticism and magic still in their mind. Versus with an older audience like that which Helldivers 2 is aimed at, you're going to get a lot more muted colors, you're going to have a lot more room to create something that is scary and something that is detailed, and you're going to have your shape language broken down a whole lot more. I use these two pictures because there's a good parallel between the way Totoro's chest pattern works and the Bile Titan's crest. Because both of them are these large open areas designed for your mind to rest a little bit, to not be overblown with detail. But within that, they have that detail nested in order to create a little bit of interest, a little bit of visual activity. The Bile Titan, every single part of it has that nuance, that additional detail in order to stack up and create a more realistic look. And that's something that you're not really going to see in things designed for younger audience. Now, of course, this is also because one of these is 2D animated and one of these is 3D. So as we talked about before, you can get more detail out of 3D. But audience is also important. All right, further, identifying what purpose this creature serves. Talking a little bit about character design here, everyone wants to design the main character, and the term main character energy is a very real thing. Main characters are often supposed to be the very most interesting thing in the room. However, you still need to have all your side characters designed too, and you need to design them in mind of keeping the main character standing out. The same is true of creature design. If you're creating a common enemy, it needs to be less interesting than your final boss, in order for your final boss to stay interesting. We have two very different dogs here, but you can probably tell which one you're supposed to actually pay attention to, right? Being able to let some things fall back and not just designing the apex predator will allow you to create much more biodiversity within your portfolio, which is a very important thing.
That was nice. I like that.
Oh, we're getting into the bio now. Welcome to biology class. So, it's really important to understand what does and doesn't exist already in nature in order to create something believable or something intentionally unbelievable. Our animal groups, the main ones we've got here, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. Those all evolved from a common ancestor. And when you're designing a creature, it's sometimes a good idea to think about where along that tree it branched off. Of course, not all the time you need to have something that is obviously made in the Earth biosystem, right? But having a little bit of an idea of how things interact and branch off from each other and typically diverge and evolve is very important to get something believable. Mixing adaptations from one group of animals into another can create something really interesting a lot of the times. However, I will caution against mixing vertebrates and invertebrates, because that's hard and complicated, because invertebrates make very little sense when you're trying to put them onto a skeleton. So do your research. So a little bit about the food chain here. All energy on Earth is derived from the sun and is passed up the food chain by the 10% rule, where only 10% of the initial energy gets passed up to the next level. So if plants are absorbing all the energy, then the creatures that eat the plants get about 10%, and the creatures who eat those get about 1%, and so on and so on. So it's important to have a vague idea of where the creature you're designing fits into that, right? Because some things need a whole lot more energy. How are they going to get that energy? Is it going to be a carnivore, or herbivore, or an omnivore? Usually with herbivores, you can go a bit bigger without it becoming too out of place, because they're getting immediately all of their energy from the plants, which is the most easily accessible. Choosing exactly what it eats can also lead to some very interesting creatures. If it has to eat something that is specifically poisonous, like the koala bears do, how is that going to interact with its system? What kind of adaptations did it have to make that accessible? What is going to eat it? Also very important. Like I said before, it's important to design your apex predators, but it's important to know that that's not always the case. You need to have background characters in order to make them pop out. So figuring out what is going to be preying on your creature is going to give you that extra little elevation, because then you can design adaptations of how it might get away from that, right? Also interesting to think about is how often something needs to eat. There are some snakes that can only eat, like once every 2 weeks or so? Versus up to a month, yeah. Versus humans, we eat every day, and sometimes that's not even enough. So figuring out where it sits there can identify with what kind of adaptations it needs to keep that energy, keep that food source consistent. And then lastly, for this slide at least, how can you make it like an interesting way of harvesting energy? If you're doing these big, huge creatures, maybe you'll have to justify it a little bit with some supplemental photosynthesis or a different way of harvesting energy. There's a lot of interesting creatures that revolve around in sci-fi settings where they absorb radiation, things like that, and how that would affect what they look like, right? These are the kind of design choices you need to be actively making in order to make your creature both believable and distinct. So, onto the fun stuff. Designing its gimmick. I don't have a better word for this, so we're calling it a gimmick. It's probably better to say adaptation, but I like gimmick.
Gimmick works better, I think.
It works better for like mechanical too if you're doing game stuff. But basically, the way that I think of a gimmick is one unique adaptation to dictate the creature's design overall. If you don't know where to start on designing a gimmick, you can always look to nature. There's plenty of fun stuff there. The example I have here, we've got a thermal imaging photo of an elephant. And if you can see all of the black around the ears, dictates that that is the coldest part right now. And the elephant's ears function like that because as the blood vessels go through the thin skin, it rapidly cools the body, allowing it to regulate its heat. The way that this has been implemented into a creature design, on the right here, we've got Anjanath from Monster Hunter, who, in order to make it a little bit more believable that this T-Rex breathes fire, has these same flaps where it raises them in order to regulate its heat, right? Like, it's not super believable, but it's that little bit, that little bit that makes this a much better design than just a fire-breathing T-Rex.
There's definitely a way to, when you're creating a fictional creature like this, even if it stretches the truth a little bit, having something like Anjanath's flap is just enough to suspend that disbelief for a viewer and make them go, oh wait, yeah, that is something that could exist.
Exactly. Also for gimmicks, you could think about things that are in real life already, but not necessarily natural. Like if you've seen all of those photos of people taking pictures of like a random object and turning it into a spaceship, you can do the same with creature design. They're great. Right now, for a class, I'm designing an ambush predator themed around being also a smoke grenade, where it has this special system of creating dandruff that then gets caught in its fur, and when it attacks, creates this big smoke bomb effect. So you can dive down many a different route to create something super interesting that also can dictate the design and help you get somewhere super unique and iconic. Okay, this is going to be long. Welcome to anatomy class. Anatomy is super important for all aspects of illustration. You just need to know this off the gate. If you're trying to avoid it, stop. I'm sorry, you need to know. You don't need to know every name of every muscle or bone, but you should have a rough idea of how they work, and you should definitely know where they go. Because it's really important to know how to draw the human body accurately before you create a horrifying monstrosity That is purposefully wrong. SCAD tells you this all the time. You need to know the rules before you break them. And it's annoying, but it's true. So the same is very true of creature design. Even if it's stylized, anatomy is super important. As you can see, we have two very different styles here, with Nico Marlette on the left and Tara Whitlatch on the right. Now, for all of your concepts, you don't need to break it down until the exact skeletal and muscular systems. Sometimes that's a bit much, and oftentimes you just simply don't have time.
Yeah.
But knowing how the muscles work helps you show the underlying anatomy in your design in the full final render, and that makes it sell. As you can see with the mastodon type creature, you can see the muscles in the final render. That's almost the exact same definition as you can in the musculature. Having those come through is what sells it. This is important to work even in stylized too, because there's also muscle groups obvious in Stormfly here on the left, right? You can see the pectorals, you can see the various...
you see the pubis bone and everything.
Exactly, yeah. You need to show that you know what you're doing, and that's going to elevate your stylizes too, because when you send this off to an animator, they're going to want to have a little bit of logic in how to animate this. And if you send them some fourth dimensional non-Euclidean concept, they're going to be confused. So you don't need to know everything's anatomy, but you should have a general idea of how things attribute to another. Creatures within the same animal group tend to have closer anatomy, but since we all came from a common ancestor, I've found that knowing basic human anatomy can translate well. So with this lovely little chart here I found, you can see that the similar colored bones are the same bones, just in different positions and with different... Oh my god, what's the word? I'll think of it later. Shape proportion, thank you!
I got you, man.
I appreciate it. A lot of what people get wrong with animal designs is the legs, because with the proportion of the bones to each other, it's hard to see the front legs of an animal as the arms of a human, right? So it's important to be able to see that the purple bone here, right? Oh, you can't see my mouse. Femur? Beautiful. Yes, the femur.
Wait,
no, the humerus. That's the humerus.
That's so funny. You guys swapped them.
I believed you.
Yeah, say it confidently enough, right?
It works. Okay. But with the humerus, they are much shorter on almost every animal than there are in humans, because that elbow is right up against the rib cage. And that's why everyone gets confused with, like, the knee of a horse, for example. I say knee in quotations, but you can't see that because this is Discord. Because that is actually the wrist. So it bends the way that your wrist would, not the way that your knee would. Because the knees are back here. Again, up near the rib cage almost. And they're going to use that same bend. So it's being able to see where the points of articulation are that's going to help you more so than just knowing how to attribute it. So the best way to get started with creature anatomy is to find a base. These are some of the ones that I've been using recently, and it's incredibly helpful to have one that has muscle anatomy. Sometimes you want it labeled, sometimes you don't. But I find that seeing the muscles is a lot more helpful than seeing the overlay of the animal, because you can kind of puzzle out how things work. And once you know how things work, you know how to make things work differently. So choosing a base animal for your thing to get the sketch down, and then start adjusting stuff. Then start playing with your squash and stretch, start adding limbs, doing whatever you need to do to make it your own. So as a concept artist, your most important thing is your brain. Your critical thinking skills are much more important than your ability to draw. Because you need to think these things through so they make sense. There are some studios who are just like, make it look cool. There are more studios who want things to actually work logically. So I find that if you don't understand something, a quick Google search will absolutely help. That goes exactly the same for anatomy. Here's just a very brief thing on how muscles work, because I find that is what people usually have the most trouble with. Muscles move bones. That's their whole purpose. Muscles move bones by having two ends, one attached to one bone and one attached to another. And then when they contract, that bone moves up. And when they relax, it moves down. Of course, you need other muscles to make that movement more intentional. But basically, if you have something that needs to move, you need to have bones attached to it, and muscles attached to those bones. Looking at similar structures in other animals will help you if you need to define that further. Like if you're slapping an extra pair of legs or an extra pair of wings on something, look at the muscles it takes to operate those, and then implement those into your design. Teeth. There are many different types of teeth, and they all have very different uses. We're going to cover 2, because we don't have time.
No, and they are the best part of any design.
They are very important.
Exactly.
Love a good tooth. So carnivorous teeth are usually sharp and very hooked, ideal for grabbing into something and not letting it get away, because if you're pulling at something that's hooked backwards, it's harder to pull out. They also oftentimes have this little ridge on the back of them that is basically for sawing through meat and tendons in order to better get that broken down so they can digest it.
Mm-hmm. Yikes.
Horrifying. Herbivore teeth are the opposite. The front teeth for most herbivores are pointed forwards in order to get a close clip to the ground so that they can clip off that grass or that plant stem. And then the back teeth are very flat with these little ridges in order to grind all of the plant fibers they have together to get that nutrients out. So knowing what your creature eats dictates its type of teeth, which then can elevate the design. Mm-hmm. Giving your creature some sort of specialized teeth, like a warthog tusk, a walrus tusk, any other tusk, a beaver's front teeth that it uses for gnawing through wood, right? That gives your creature storytelling. That helps you define its lifestyle visually. I've also heard it somewhere that I wish I could remember who actually said it, that oftentimes the first thing you notice on an animal is what it uses to hit other animals with. That's
so true.
Largely true, because that's what antlers are, and that's what tusks are. And so if you're thinking about those in that way, it's using those to assert dominance over other members of its own species. So what kind of things make this creature stand out against others in its own field, right? Mm-hmm. Breaking it down even further.
So those subtleties that really matter when it's doing these, like those teeth on the herbivore there, they all have that front-facing clipped teeth, but even if it's the difference between like a new shoot versus a woody plant is going to change exactly the formation of that, and all those little subtleties will come together to make your little critter. Exactly. You need to know everything about your design to make it make sense. Exactly.
This is your creature. It's your baby.
Literally, you are giving birth to it. You have to think it through.
Speaking of thinking things through, let's talk about claws. Claws, like teeth, have very intentional meanings. And also, like teeth, are usually either hooked or not hooked. Let's talk about dog claws for a second. And I say dog claws. They're dog tribe claws, largely, and non-retractable claws are primarily there to help you walk and run through uneven terrain. They are non-retractable in order to be able to do that, right? And they're often duller because they're constantly being used. Cat claws are sharp and hooked and made to grab onto prey and hold it very closely, like we talked about with the predator teeth. That said, they need to be retractable in order to keep that sharpness. That's why you'll see cats often sharpening their claws on furniture and trees. They're trying to keep their adaptations honed. An interesting anomaly with that is the cheetah, which has retractable claws on its front feet and non-retractable on its back, because it is known for running super duper fast. And the way you do that is by having a little bit of a cleat going.
Interesting.
Nice little mix of them there.
Yeah.
And again, that's like a little nuance that you can give to really elevate your designs.
Yeah, exactly. True. Something like that, a little exception to the rule.
Exactly.
Like push your phone.
And then lastly, I'm going to talk about hooves here for a second. It's weird to think of claws as hooves, but it's kind of accurate because they're essentially just an extra hard fingernail designed for animals who run long distances.
Yuck.
It's terrible. I have horses. It's terrible.
Oh yeah, dude. That's cool.
But those are made to give extra support when running and when traveling. There are different types of hooves depending on how many toes that creature has. Horses, for example, are one-toed. I believe rhinoceroses are three-toed. Mm-hmm. Most deer are two-toed, except for there's some that technically count as four because of the way that the dew claws work. Mm-hmm. But again, this is all going to boil down to think it through and make it make sense. Mm-hmm. I'm just giving you what little parts I can in this brief time. All right, there's a lot of wings in creature designs. I really want you to make these make sense and get them right, because so often in media does it get through that they're not quite correct, and it annoys me so much.
It's the easiest thing to mess up.
It's the easiest thing to mess up. Because oftentimes you're adding them to a creature that isn't supposed to have wings, so it doesn't have the reason to have wings. But basically, there are 3 main types of wings that have all evolved separately. Bat and bird wings are just modified arms. As you can see, again, using the very fun models with the same bones being the same color, the bat and the bird have basically an arm. The only difference being that the bat's wing is made by stretching membrane between the fingers, those yellow bones, versus the bird has all the fingers fused. So it essentially just has this one big fleshy tube that is then a form for all the feathers to then be attached to. Insect wings are completely different. And this is where that not using vertebrates and invertebrates interchangeably comes in, because this wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah. The closest you'll get to an insect wing on a vertebrate is something like the Draco lizard, where it's just between the rib membrane. But yeah, no, that is in a league of its own.
It's completely different. It essentially is just a series of supports with cells in between them stretch across.
I did not know that.
It's weird. That's why they're so delicate, too, and often have like that chitinous covering that beetles get, because those are just super delicate and made to go super fast.
Look at that. Learning something new every day.
I put so much time into these slides. Alright, pet peeve. The most common mistake with wings is putting a finger at the elbow joint for dragons. It has made it into countless feature film media.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And I get why, it's an extra support, so to speak, but it's not one that is needed or makes sense. If you're looking for a way to give extra support to wings, there are much more interesting ways that you can come up with to not just be reiterating the same incorrect anatomy over and over again.
There's also a way to get around the elbow spur, which is to have a cartilaginous spur from the wrist, kind of like in that dinosaur, I'm going to mispronounce his name, like Yichi, with the who had the membranous wings, and also had, in addition to the fingers, a spur that goes from that wrist area out where the shoulder would be. So if you do something similar, I've done it with my dragons, where it can end where the elbow spike would end, but it's not coming out of the actual elbow. So there's if you know the anatomy, you can do some workarounds.
Think while you draw.
Think while you draw.
I beg you. Alright, so that's all my anatomy for now. We're going to talk a little bit about making it iconic, and then I will pass it off to Sawyer here.
Yay.
So once you have your base idea stretched out, I have found that the best way to push your design to make it memorable is by lassoing parts and stretching them. Find a fun shape and push it as far as you can reasonably within your style. Oftentimes, that ends you up with creatures with wacky head shapes, as you can see here. We're going to go through them real quickly. The Reaper Leviathan from Subnautica on the leftmost has probably the weirdest head shape of all of these. And those 2 mandibles with the sharp hooked teeth, if you've been listening, you can probably tell what that's for. The whole gimmick behind him is that he grabs onto things with those mandibles and attacks them while they're stuck to his face. That's a very good example of the design following the mechanics of a game, while also creating something incredibly weird.
Yeah.
That horn on him, that's pretty much just for design. That's just creating a cool, interesting shape right there.
Stuff like that is easy enough. You could just say it's for attracting mates.
Exactly. That is what it's for. The first thing you notice is what they hit other creatures with and what they're most attracted to.
Exactly.
Going a different route, Toothless here, as everyone probably knows and loves, is very friendly and round. All of his shapes are round. And within that, he's one of the only How to Train Your Dragon dragons who don't have hard horns. He's an axolotl, essentially.
So true.
And he has these frills, in order for them to be able to go back and emphasize the speed, but also so that he looks friendly. Everything is rounded. Even the smaller scales that are black on black, those are also rounded. He has retractable teeth in order for him to not have the one sharp aspect that all of their other dragons have sometimes. Everything about him is to be friendly. Now, taking round in a different way, our Jurassic Park Diplo, very wrong anatomy, completely unscientifically accurate, but he is a creature design, so we're going to cover it.
He's a fun creature design,
he's
not
a fun guy.
construction.
He's not right. But he's got these very rounded ridges on his head. The first time you see him in the movie, you don't see the big frills. You see the rounded ridges, and he's presented in a way that is potentially friendly, that is curious. That's what those rounded shapes give you. However, when it transitions from him being curious to dangerous, that frill comes out. And while the frill itself is round, you get all those little minute spikes around the end, right? That just kind of cuts into it. All of the patterning on it is very pointed. It's diamond shaped. So things like that can make your creature go from friendly to dangerous very quickly. I show that too because it's a very realistic style, but it's still got shape language. You can break it down even further. And really, if you're trying to use shape language, actually I should just go to the next slide because that's all this is. If you're trying to use shape language in a realistic style, those shapes just get smaller. Here we've got two polar different examples. The Gremloblin from Gravity Falls, he is square. Everything about him is pretty square. He's a little bit rounded, but he's mostly designed to be a kids' show strong monster. Versus Nergigante, my personal favorite monster, is is all spikes. Everything about him is strong. It is dangerous, but he's not comically triangular. Mm-hmm. He has every little aspect of him. All the scales are these pointed shapes. You can take the same thing as you did with Toothless there. If we go back here, imagine if Toothless's little tiny scales were pointed. That's a different monster entirely. Or if they were square and more armor-like, that becomes strong. Mm-hmm. When you're doing things in a realistic style, breaking them down smaller and smaller allows you to basically use that shape language as your own personal secret weapon, and you can apply it to almost every aspect of a design. Mm-hmm. And I believe with that is all I've got. So I will hand you to Sawyer.
Well, hello, concept art people. This is so exciting. Thank you for having me. All right, so this presentation has covered a lot of the really great basics, and for my segment, I would like to talk about my personal tips and tricks, things that have helped me using these bases to sort of embellish my own work. So here we have thinking in evolutionary terms. When you design, anatomy is that design. So instead of thinking, and it's easy to get into the spiral of, oh, I need to add a spike, I need to add a certain texture here, and then the actual structure itself might be a little lacking. This goes back to that anatomy slide we had. You think, okay, well, this creature, what does it need to look the way it does? I think it was Tara Whitlatch that said, a creature looks the way that it's supposed to act, and nothing more, nothing less. So for here, this is a giant that I did. The idea was that it lived in polar environments and that it was a big human. So if a human needs to get big, obviously, how is he going to hold himself up? He's got these huge column-like feet and this thick, rubbery skin to protect against the cold, this mantle of fur, and even then it'd be easy to cover him in Yeti-like fur, but you want to do some subtleties in there. So he's almost more like a bison, which is taking advantage of inspirations found in nature. in nature. He has more of a ruff on his back, and then it goes into a more fine coat throughout the rest of the body. You want to think about everything. I think the best way to go about it is to write yourself almost as if you're doing a pitch of what is this creature in one sentence. And once you filter it down to that, the core aspect, then you get to designing how it actually evolved. All right, so and here nature does indeed have the best designs ever. And even in the very little subtle things. So here I have a desert dragon that I did, and often when you look at your references of real animals, even the most subtle, unassuming little lizard will have something wonderful for you to be inspired by. Here's the fringe-toed lizard. It's found in the California area, little Arizona area. It has these lovely little feather-like scales on its toes that prevent it from sinking in sand. It has a whole other suite of adaptations, but I love the shape that gave. It's spiky, which you'd expect a dragon to be, but it's got function. So here on my guy, you got his own feet have that same brush-like snowshoe effect. That can go through the whole entire thing. This particular one is supposed to be silvery to reflect the heat of the desert back out into the sky. It's a whole thing you could think of. You could break this down to the most minute detail. If you want spikes for that dangerous effect, they have function. You want to, here you get the toes, but also on the back, you could say that's heat dispersal, that's mating displays, that's even protection. There is all kinds of different directions you can go with this. Now, this is really important to me personally when I work, is the push and the pull. When you're designing, you kind of want to think in terms of a budget, because I'm sure all of you have seen over-designed creatures before, characters especially, but it can happen with creatures. Real animals can get insane. They can get wacky. And something I've noticed with some like shows, movies, what have you, when they try to make a realistic creature, and they're often very serviceable, but they can often sand down the edges of what makes them distinct. I tend to think of the How to Train Your Dragon live action. Some of those cartoony features actually could have been ported into their live action counterparts. I think of like a Caprosuchus skull, and how those eyes are pinched so far up the head, and then the head swings down into these huge teeth. It's almost like you look at it and you think, wow, that's actually a cartoony looking creature. Or the hippopotamus has these huge fangs that come up in these like stalk eyes. It's a wild animal. But then the body is simple. When I design something, I tend to think the more textured the body is, the simpler of a pattern I'm going to give it. If it's a large animal and it's textured, it has a simple pattern. Here you get the snake, and I follow this as well. If it's small, then I can get a little more color in there. You think of what would the animal budget its energy towards? Growth or display or different parts? You know, it's all, that's how nature works. It's a budgeting, and they have to be very economical with how they get, especially large animals like dragons. It's a whole thing to follow. And I think by doing that, then you boil down your design into what is actually most important. So instead of, let's say you have a dragon that is known for its bite force, rather than focusing on what is on its hip too much, you could go, all right, well, it needs to really bite these things. Let's really focus on that jaw, and how does the rest of the body cascade off of that? All right, and then these limits will breed your creativity. Ground rules and other such things, I think, are the best sort of launching off point from this. I designed like over 100 dragons, nearly 100 for the first book, and then, I have a whole thing going on. And I think the reason I was able to accomplish that was because I set a limit. All these creatures had to be related to each other from a common ancestor, and they could only possess 4 limbs or fewer. So how do you get around that? And then where do they live? What do they eat? All the stuff we covered in this presentation can birth forth all kinds of interesting designs. Even if you wanted to, I had one recently where I wanted that 6-limbed classical fairy tale dragon look. So I gave him a sail on his back instead of wings that was conveniently shaped in a wing-like fashion.
We love a convenient sail.
Of course, kind of like Antoinette, exactly. And it is all sorts of interesting ways. And once you get into the biology of it, then it starts cascading. You go, well, what does it eat? What eats it? And then you could just have so much fun on a runaway goose chase after your own critters. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I think that's all we've got for here. I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties. We've got about 4 minutes here if you want to fire off some questions.
Oh, yeah.
Otherwise, we can wrap up.
That would be fun.
People in the room, feel free to shout out. People in the chat, feel free to text.